Wait. Stop scrolling. Because what you're about to hear will make you believe in miracles again. This is not a typical love story. This is not a typical wedding story. This is the story of a woman who did something so radical, so unexpected, so beautiful that it changed an entire community's understanding of what's possible. Her name is Rachel. She is 29 years old. She grew up in a small town where everyone knew everyone. Rachel was raised by her single mother. Rachel watched her mother work 2 jobs to keep them afloat. Rachel learned early that life was hard, that dreams were difficult, that good things happened to other people, not to people like her. But Rachel had a dream. Rachel dreamed of getting married. Rachel dreamed of having a family. Rachel dreamed of building a life that was different from her mother's life. And then she met him. His name is David. He is 35 years old. He is a billionaire. He is the CEO of one of the largest technology companies in the world. David comes from money. David had everything handed to him. But David had something that money couldn't buy. David was in a wheelchair. David had been in a wheelchair for 5 years. David had an accident that paralyzed him from the waist down. David lost the ability to walk. And because David lost the ability to walk, David lost most of the people in his life. People abandoned him. People didn't know how to handle his disability. People saw him as broken. Everyone except Rachel. Rachel saw David at a charity event. Rachel didn't know who he was. Rachel just saw a man. Rachel saw his smile. Rachel saw his intelligence. Rachel saw his kindness. And Rachel fell in love. David was shocked. David had been invisible to women for 5 years. David had assumed that nobody would ever love him because of his disability. But Rachel loved him. Rachel loved him completely. Rachel loved him without conditions. They got together. They built a life together. They fell deeper in love. And then David proposed. David got down on one knee, even though getting on one knee required him to transfer out of his wheelchair and transfer onto the ground, because he wanted to propose to Rachel the traditional way. Rachel said yes. Rachel didn't hesitate. Rachel didn't have doubts. Rachel knew that David was the man she wanted to spend the rest of her life with. And then Rachel did something that shocked everyone. Rachel asked David to walk her down the aisle. The room went silent. Nobody knew what to do. David had been in a wheelchair for 5 years. David couldn't walk. Everyone assumed that Rachel meant something else. Everyone assumed that Rachel didn't understand what she was asking. But Rachel knew exactly what she was asking. And David knew exactly what she was asking. And what happened next will leave you speechless. On the day of the wedding, as the music started and as Rachel stood at the back of the church in her white dress, something miraculous happened. Something that nobody expected. Something that would be talked about for years to come. David did something that nobody thought was possible. David did something that left the entire church frozen in shock. David did something that proved that miracles are real and that love is stronger than any physical limitation. And when David did what he did, when Rachel saw what he did, when the entire church witnessed what happened next, there wasn't a single dry eye in the building. This is the story of a woman who believed in someone when nobody else did. This is the story of a man who was willing to move mountains for love. This is the story of what happens when love becomes more powerful than physical limitation. This is the story of a miracle. And by the end, you will understand that true love isn't about perfection. True love is about seeing someone completely, accepting them completely, and believing in them completely. If you've ever wondered if miracles are real, if you've ever doubted that love can overcome anything, if you've ever questioned whether people can do impossible things for love, this story is going to change your mind. Rate this story from 0 to 10. Tell me in the comments if you believe in miracles. Tell me if you think love is worth fighting for. Tell me if you believe that disability doesn't define someone's worth. But most importantly, tell me this. Would you have the courage to do what Rachel did? Would you have the faith to believe in someone the way David learned to believe in himself? Let's find out what happened at that wedding. David had been in a wheelchair for 5 years. 5 years since the accident. 5 years since his life fundamentally changed. The accident happened on a Tuesday. David was 30 years old. David was at the peak of his career. David was unstoppable. David was the youngest CEO in his company's history. David was building something revolutionary. David was going to change the world. And then everything stopped. David was driving to a meeting. David wasn't paying attention. David was texting. David ran a red light. David collided with another vehicle at full speed. The crash severed David's spinal cord. The crash left David paralyzed from the waist down. The crash took away David's ability to walk. And the crash took away most of the people in David's life. David spent 3 months in the hospital. During those 3 months, his so-called friends stopped visiting. His so-called friends couldn't handle seeing him in the hospital bed. His so-called friends couldn't handle the reality of his disability. His family was divided. His mother was supportive. His father was angry. His father said, "You're no longer the man I raised. You're a disabled person now. I can't look at you without thinking about everything you've lost." His father eventually left. His father went to live with another woman. His father abandoned David because David was no longer the perfect son. David's relationships fell apart. He had been dating someone named Catherine. Catherine came to the hospital once. Catherine saw David in the wheelchair. Catherine said, "I can't do this. I can't be with someone like you. I'm sorry, but I just can't." And Catherine left. David spent the next 5 years learning what it meant to be invisible. David learned that people looked away from him. David learned that people didn't know how to talk to him. David learned that people saw the wheelchair first and him second, if they saw him at all. David built his company from his wheelchair. David proved that disability didn't affect his intelligence or his business acumen. David's company became more successful, more innovative, more profitable. David became a billionaire while in a wheelchair. But money couldn't fix the isolation. Money couldn't give him back his mobility. Money couldn't give him back the people he had lost. David lived alone in a penthouse. David had assistants and employees, but he had no friends. David had colleagues, but he had no family. David was one of the most powerful men in the world, but he was profoundly, desperately, achingly alone. David had accepted that he would never fall in love again. David had accepted that nobody would ever want to be with him because of the wheelchair. David had made peace with a life of solitude. Until he met Rachel. David went to a charity event. David attended these events regularly. They were part of his obligation as a wealthy businessman. David usually left early. David usually felt more isolated at these events than anywhere else. But this time was different. This time he met Rachel. Rachel was working at the charity event. Rachel was a volunteer. Rachel was helping elderly attendees to their seats. Rachel was carrying water glasses to tables. Rachel was doing menial work that most people wouldn't pay attention to. But David paid attention. David watched Rachel move through the room. David noticed that Rachel had genuine care for the elderly people. David noticed that Rachel wasn't doing the work because she was obligated. David noticed that Rachel was doing the work because she actually cared. And then Rachel approached David's table. And when Rachel saw David, Rachel didn't look away. Rachel didn't suddenly become uncomfortable. Rachel didn't treat David as a charity case. Rachel just treated him like a person. "Hi there," Rachel said with a genuine smile. "Can I get you anything?" "Water would be great," David said. Rachel brought water. Rachel asked David his name. Rachel sat with David for a few minutes. Rachel was interested in who David was as a person, not in whether he could walk. David was completely unprepared for kindness. David was completely unprepared for genuine human connection. David felt something that he hadn't felt in 5 years. He felt seen. After the charity event, David asked Rachel if he could get her contact information. David wanted to see her again. Rachel gave him her number. Rachel said, "I'd like that." Over the next month, David and Rachel spent time together. David took Rachel to nice restaurants. David showed Rachel his world. But more importantly, Rachel showed David her world. Rachel took David to community centers. Rachel took David to parks. Rachel took David to places where people didn't care about money or status. Rachel showed David that life was bigger than his penthouse, his company, his power. And Rachel showed David something else. Rachel showed David that disability wasn't a barrier to living a full life. Rachel knew people with disabilities. Rachel worked with people with disabilities. Rachel understood that the limitations were often imposed by society, not by the disability itself. Rachel asked David about his accident. David told Rachel everything. David told Rachel about losing his mobility, losing his family, losing his friends. David told Rachel about the depression, the suicidal thoughts, the years of isolation. And Rachel listened without pity. Rachel listened without trying to fix David. Rachel listened with genuine compassion. "You know what I see when I look at you?" Rachel said. "What?" David asked. "I see a person who has been through something incredibly hard and survived it. I see a person who didn't let his disability stop him from achieving incredible things. I see a person who is stronger than most people will ever be." David had never been spoken to like that before. David had never had anyone acknowledge his strength instead of his limitation. And David fell in love with Rachel. 6 months after meeting Rachel, David decided to propose. David spent weeks planning the proposal. David wanted it to be perfect. David wanted Rachel to feel loved and cherished. David wanted to do something traditional but also something that acknowledged Rachel's unique view of the world. David proposed at the park where they had their first real conversation. David got out of his wheelchair. David transferred onto the ground. David got down on one knee, even though getting on one knee meant he couldn't support his own weight and he had to have Rachel help him stabilize. But David did it anyway. David wanted Rachel to know that he was willing to move mountains for her. David wanted Rachel to know that the wheelchair wasn't going to stop him from loving her the way she deserved to be loved. David proposed with his grandmother's ring. David said, "Rachel, you have shown me that my disability doesn't define me. You have shown me that I am worthy of love. You have shown me that miracles are real. Will you marry me?" Rachel cried. Rachel said yes. Rachel helped David back into his wheelchair. Rachel kissed him. Rachel said, "I'm going to love you for the rest of my life." And Rachel meant it. Rachel and David started planning their wedding. Rachel wanted something small and meaningful. Rachel didn't want an extravagant billionaire wedding with thousands of guests. Rachel wanted a wedding that reflected who they were as a couple. The wedding was planned for a small church in Rachel's hometown. The guest list was 150 people. Family, close friends, people who mattered to both of them. The wedding was going to be simple. The wedding was going to be beautiful. The wedding was going to be real. But then Rachel asked David to walk her down the aisle. And everything changed. When Rachel asked this, David's first reaction was shock. David said, "Rachel, I can't walk. I've been in a wheelchair for 5 years. I can't walk you down the aisle." But Rachel said, "I know you can't walk in the traditional sense. But I believe that you will find a way. I believe that you will do something special. I believe in you." David didn't know what Rachel meant. David was confused. But David also understood something fundamental. Rachel was asking him to do something extraordinary. Rachel was asking him to push himself beyond what he thought was possible. Rachel was asking him to prove to himself and to the world that disability doesn't define capability. And David said yes. David started working with a physical therapist. David hadn't done intensive physical therapy in years. David had accepted his disability and learned to live with it. But he hadn't pushed himself to see what was possible. The physical therapist showed David something new. The physical therapist showed David that even though David couldn't walk in the traditional sense, David could potentially stand with assistance. David could potentially take steps with support. David could potentially walk with a walker or with someone helping him balance. But David wanted more than that. David wanted to do something that nobody had ever done. David wanted to create a moment that would mean something not just to Rachel, but to everyone who witnessed it. David and the physical therapist worked together for 3 months. They developed a plan. They practiced endlessly. They pushed David's body to the limits. They pushed David's mind to the limits. And they created something miraculous. David discovered that with a specially designed apparatus and with significant preparation, he could walk. Not the way he walked before the accident, but a way that he could walk. A way that was difficult and required support, but a way that was possible. David's legs had atrophied over 5 years. David's legs were weak. But David's legs could still move. And with training, with equipment, with determination, David could walk. By the time the wedding arrived, David and his physical therapist had a plan. The plan involved a specially designed walker, lightweight but sturdy. The plan involved months of preparation. The plan involved David pushing himself harder than he had ever pushed himself since the accident. Rachel didn't know what David was planning. David wanted it to be a surprise. David wanted Rachel to experience the miracle of the moment with everyone else. The wedding day arrived. The church was full. Friends and family were seated. The music started. The bridesmaids walked down the aisle. And then Rachel appeared at the back of the church in her white dress. Everyone stood. Everyone turned to watch Rachel walk down the aisle. But Rachel wasn't walking down the aisle alone. At the back of the church, David stood. David was standing. David was not in his wheelchair. David was standing with the help of a specially designed walker. David was standing with incredible effort, incredible pain, incredible determination. Rachel saw David and she understood immediately what he had done. Rachel understood that David had spent months preparing for this moment. Rachel understood that David had pushed his body to the absolute limit. Rachel understood that David was standing, truly standing, to walk her down the aisle. And Rachel started to cry. David began to move. David took a step. David's leg moved forward. David took another step. David was walking. Slowly, painfully, with incredible effort, David was walking. The entire church went silent. Nobody was breathing. Everyone was watching David do something that they didn't think was possible. Everyone was watching a miracle happen. David walked slowly down the aisle. Each step was a victory. Each step was an effort. Each step was a testament to David's love for Rachel and his belief in himself. Rachel walked beside David. Rachel didn't try to help him. Rachel didn't try to make it easier. Rachel just walked beside him. Rachel held his arm, not to support him but to be with him. Rachel cried as her partner walked her down the aisle for the first time since his accident. When they reached the altar, David had to sit back down in his wheelchair. David's legs were exhausted. David's body had given everything it had. But David had done it. David had walked his bride down the aisle. The entire church erupted in applause. People were standing and crying. People were witnessing a moment that they would never forget. People were witnessing what love looks like when love is willing to push beyond limits. The ceremony continued. David and Rachel exchanged vows. David talked about finding strength in Rachel. Rachel talked about finding love and belief in David. And when they kissed, the church erupted in applause again. David had walked Rachel down the aisle. And in doing so, David had walked himself back into believing that anything was possible. The video of the wedding went viral. Within days, millions of people had watched David walk down the aisle. Millions of people were crying. Millions of people were sharing the video. Millions of people were telling David's story to their friends and family. News organizations picked up the story. The headline was everywhere. Billionaire in wheelchair walks down aisle for love. The story became a symbol of what's possible when love is strong enough. The story became a testament to the power of human determination and resilience. But what people didn't understand was the real story. The real story wasn't about David overcoming his disability. The real story wasn't about David proving that disabled people can do extraordinary things, although that was part of it. The real story was about Rachel. The real story was about a woman who saw someone that nobody else could see. The real story was about a woman who believed in someone when nobody else did. The real story was about a woman who loved someone completely and asked them to believe in themselves. Rachel didn't ask David to walk because she thought disabled people should have to do extraordinary things to deserve love. Rachel asked David to walk because she wanted David to discover what he was capable of. Rachel asked David to walk because she knew that David's greatest limitation wasn't his wheelchair. It was his belief in his own limitations. And David learned that. David discovered that when someone believes in you completely, you can do things that you never thought were possible. David never walked again after the wedding. The effort was too great. The pain was too much. David couldn't sustain walking in his daily life. But David also didn't need to. David had proven what he needed to prove. Not to the world, but to himself. David understood that he wasn't defined by his ability to walk. David understood that his disability didn't limit his ability to love, to build, to create, to matter. David understood that the wheelchair wasn't a limitation. The wheelchair was a tool that allowed him to live his life fully. Rachel and David got married. They built a life together. And their wedding video became a symbol of what love can do. Here's what I want you to understand about this story, and I need you to really hear this because this is the part that matters most. This is not a story about disability being overcome. This is not some inspiration porn narrative where a disabled person has to do something extraordinary just to prove their worth to the world. This is not a story designed to make able-bodied people feel good about themselves by watching a disabled person struggle. This is a story about love being more powerful than any physical limitation. This is a story about what happens when one person decides that another person is worth believing in. This is a story about the transformative power of unconditional acceptance combined with radical belief in someone's potential. Rachel didn't love David because he walked for her. Rachel didn't fall in love with David and then demand that he prove himself by doing something impossible. Rachel loved David before the walking ever happened. Rachel loved David when he was sitting in his wheelchair, when he thought he was broken, when he believed that nobody would ever want him. Rachel loved David completely and unconditionally, exactly as he was. But here's the thing that people miss when they tell this story. Rachel also knew something that David had forgotten. Rachel knew something that 5 years of isolation and rejection had made David forget. Rachel knew that people are capable of so much more than they believe they're capable of. Rachel knew that sometimes the only thing holding people back isn't their physical limitations. It's their belief in their limitations. And Rachel knew that sometimes people need someone else to believe in them before they can believe in themselves. Sometimes you need someone to look at you and say, I see who you are. I see what you're capable of. I believe in you even when you don't believe in yourself. Sometimes you need that external belief to spark internal belief. This is the lesson that nobody talks about. When someone loves you completely, truly, authentically loves you, they will ask you to be more than you think you can be. Not because they're cruel. Not because they're trying to punish you or make you prove yourself. But because they see your potential. They see who you could become. They believe in you even when you don't believe in yourself. And when you are loved that way, when someone sees your potential and believes in it so completely that they're willing to ask you to stretch yourself, you can do things that seem impossible. You can push past limitations that you thought were permanent. You can discover that you're stronger than you ever imagined. You can become more than you ever thought possible. This is what happened with David. David didn't wake up one morning and think, I'm going to walk down the aisle at my wedding. David didn't suddenly believe in himself. David's belief came from Rachel. David's belief came from being loved so completely by another person that he was willing to push his body and his mind to the absolute limit. This story is also about something deeper, something more fundamental about how human transformation actually works. This story is about the combination of radical acceptance and radical belief in potential, and why you need both of these things working together. Rachel accepted David completely as he was. Rachel didn't love David conditionally. Rachel didn't say, I will love you if you get better, if you walk again, if you overcome your disability. Rachel accepted the wheelchair. Rachel accepted the disability. Rachel accepted all of it. Rachel accepted David completely, exactly as he was in that moment. But Rachel also believed that David was capable of more than David believed he was capable of. Rachel didn't just accept David's limitations as permanent. Rachel saw beyond the wheelchair. Rachel saw someone who had 5 years of being told that they were broken, that they were less than, that they were unworthy of love. Rachel saw someone who had internalized that message. Rachel saw someone who had stopped believing in themselves. And Rachel believed in David anyway. Rachel believed that David could push himself. Rachel believed that David could discover new possibilities. Rachel believed that David's disability didn't define his potential. This combination, radical acceptance plus radical belief in potential, is what actually transforms people. This is the formula for human transformation. This is what makes miracles possible. You need both. If you have only radical acceptance, if you only accept people exactly as they are and never challenge them to be more, you can become complacent. You can settle. You can stop growing. You can become stuck in your current reality because nobody is asking you to imagine something more. But if you have only radical belief in potential, if you only push people to be better without accepting them as they are, you become critical. You become judgmental. You become someone who is always finding fault, always pointing out what's wrong, always focusing on the gap between who someone is and who they could be. That kind of belief without acceptance becomes toxic. That becomes pressure. That becomes abuse. But when you have both, when someone accepts you completely while also believing that you can be more, when someone loves you for who you are right now while also seeing who you could become, when someone says yes to all of you while also gently pushing you toward your potential, that's when miracles happen. That's when transformation becomes possible. That's when a man who has been in a wheelchair for 5 years decides that he's going to walk down the aisle. I want you to understand something about the aftermath of David and Rachel's wedding. The video went viral. Millions of people watched David walk down the aisle. Millions of people were moved to tears. But what happened next is equally important. David never walked again after that wedding day. The physical effort was too great. The pain was too much. David's body simply couldn't sustain that level of exertion. Walking for David wasn't something he could do on a daily basis. Walking for David was a one-time extraordinary effort. But David also didn't need to walk again. David had already accomplished what he needed to accomplish. David had already learned what he needed to learn. David had already discovered what Rachel had known all along, that his disability didn't define him, that his wheelchair wasn't a prison, that his limitations were real but they weren't insurmountable. And here's the important part. David didn't feel like a failure because he couldn't walk after the wedding. David didn't feel like he had proven something and then lost it. David understood that what he had done wasn't about walking. Walking was just the physical manifestation of something much deeper. Walking was just the external expression of internal transformation. What David had actually done was prove to himself that he was capable. What David had actually done was discover that belief changes possibility. What David had actually done was understand that love transforms everything. And David went back to his wheelchair. David went back to his life in his wheelchair. But David was a different man in that wheelchair. David was a man who had discovered his potential. David was a man who had experienced what's possible when someone believes in you. David was a man who understood that his worth wasn't determined by his ability to walk. This is the part of the story that matters. This is the part that people miss when they talk about the inspiration of David walking. The real inspiration isn't David walking. The real inspiration is David understanding that he is worthy exactly as he is, while also being willing to push himself when someone he loves asks him to. So here's what I want you to take from this story, and this is different depending on who you are and where you are in your life. If you are like David, if you have limitations, if you have been hurt, if you have been told that you're not good enough, if you have accepted that certain things are impossible, if you have spent so long with your limitations that you've started to believe that they're permanent, understand this, your limitations are not permanent. Your past doesn't determine your future. Your current circumstances don't determine your ultimate capability. And sometimes you just need one person to believe in you before you can believe in yourself. Sometimes that's all it takes. Sometimes a single person saying, "I see you. I believe in you. I know you're capable of more than you think. Sometimes that's enough to change everything. But also understand this. Don't wait for that person. Don't wait for someone else to believe in you before you start believing in yourself. The fastest way to change your life is to start believing in yourself today. Start believing that your limitations aren't permanent. Start believing that you're capable of more than you think. Start pushing past what you thought was possible. If you are like Rachel, if you see potential in people that they don't see in themselves, if you believe in people, if you look at someone and you see who they could become, if you want to help people discover what they're capable of, understand this. That love, that belief, that faith in other people's potential, that is one of the most powerful forces in the universe. That belief can literally change lives. That belief can literally create miracles. That belief can take someone who has given up and show them that they're capable of extraordinary things. You have the power to do that. Your belief in other people has the power to transform their lives. But also understand this. Your belief has to be paired with acceptance. Your belief in someone's potential has to be accompanied by acceptance of who they are right now. If you believe in someone's potential but you don't accept them as they are, you become critical. You become demanding. You become someone who is always pointing out what's wrong instead of celebrating what's right. But if you combine your belief with radical acceptance, if you say, I love you exactly as you are, and I also believe that you're capable of more, that's when you become transformative. That's when you become the kind of person who changes lives. Here's what I want you to understand about the nature of miracles. Miracles aren't magical. Miracles aren't supernatural. Miracles aren't these rare occurrences that happen to other people. Miracles are what happens when someone decides that their limitations aren't going to stop them. Miracles are what happens when someone refuses to accept that something is impossible. Miracles are what happens when love is stronger than doubt. David's walk down the aisle was a miracle. But it wasn't a miracle because something magical happened. It was a miracle because David made a decision. David decided that he was going to push his body to its absolute limit. David decided that for the woman he loved, he was going to do something that he had told himself was impossible. And Rachel's love for David was a miracle. But it wasn't a miracle because Rachel did something extraordinary from the beginning. It was a miracle because Rachel saw someone that the world had discarded and she chose to love them. She chose to see their worth. She chose to believe in their potential. She chose to ask them to believe in themselves. These aren't miracles that require divine intervention. These are miracles that require courage. These are miracles that require belief. These are miracles that require love. And you can create miracles. You can be the person who miracles happen around. You can be the Rachel who believes in someone completely. Or you can be the David who pushes past your limitations and discovers what you're truly capable of. The truth is that we live in a world that is often focused on limitations. We live in a world that tells us what we can't do. We live in a world that constructs barriers and then tells us that those barriers are immovable. We live in a world that is expert at convincing us that change is impossible. But David and Rachel's story proves something different. David and Rachel's story proves that change is possible. Transformation is possible. Miracles are possible. They're not probable, but they're possible. And you know what determines whether they happen in your life? You do. Your belief determines whether miracles happen. Your willingness to push past what you think is possible determines whether miracles happen. Your ability to accept yourself and others completely while also believing in potential determines whether miracles happen. This is the most important thing I can tell you. Don't accept the world's definition of what's possible. Don't accept society's limitations for you. Don't accept anyone else's belief in your limitations. Instead, be like David. Push. Strive. Believe. And be like Rachel. See potential in others. Believe in people. Ask them to believe in themselves. Because when you do that, when you combine self-belief with belief in others, when you combine pushing yourself with accepting others, when you combine desire for growth with acceptance of current reality, that's when miracles happen. That's when ordinary people do extraordinary things. That's when love transforms lives. David and Rachel created a miracle. And you can too. The miracle you create might not look like David walking down the aisle. Your miracle might look completely different. Your miracle might be small and quiet and only meaningful to you and the people you love. Your miracle might be a conversation that changes someone's life. Your miracle might be pushing past a fear you've had for years. Your miracle might be finally believing in yourself after a lifetime of doubt. But your miracle is possible. Your miracle is waiting for you. Your miracle only requires one thing: your willingness to believe that it's possible. So start today. Start now. Start believing. Start pushing. Start asking people to believe in themselves. Start seeing potential in others. Start creating the miracle that your life can be. Because miracles are real. And they're not waiting for you somewhere else. They're waiting for you right here, right now, in the life you're living. You just have to be willing to see them. You just have to be willing to believe in them. You just have to be willing to create them. I'll see you next time.